And it's BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, everybody. Today is Thursday. Welcome to True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. I am your host, Black Box Ned. True Crime Talk Radio is a segment where I talk about multiple true crime stories within a single episode. And because today is Thursday, we can all say hello to the Fox. Now, in this episode, I'm going to be responding to a video from the Internet Investigators, examining the new comments that have been made by Ken Maines about the recent Zodiac Killer news, and looking at the story of Peter Lundin, who was a Danish serial killer. And we have some people in the chat already. We have Mr. JSV here, who says good morning, and also Mr. JSV is raising his coffee cup. Cheers to you, Mr. JSV. We have Charlie here, who says good afternoon. Actually, it says morning, evening, afternoon. Now, Charlie, is that by chance a reference to The Truman Show? Good morning, and in case I don't see you again, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. And we have Tyler Scott here who says morning to all. So I would like to begin with a video that I was watching from the channel The Internet Investigators that was telling the story of a homicide detective who had psychopathic tendencies. Actually, it's even beyond that. He was a clinical psychopath, even though clinical psychopathy is not something that is widely discussed in terms of the DSM, but that's how I understand it, and that's how I like to arrange it. And because I've been watching lots of videos about criminal psychology lately, I think the terminology that helps me keep things in line is clinical psychopathy, subclinical psychopathy, and then secondary psychopathy, because this is purely for me. This is not something you should take to a psychology conference. This is something that you can just incorporate into your daily life to try and understand people in a different way. And Casbah is here. Good morning, Casbah. William Kane is here, says hi, Ned. Hi to you, William Kane. So I was watching this video about the detective who was a clinical psychopath, and a lot of people were asking him these questions, and he was dealt with one that comes up very frequently for him, and that is, why would you choose to be a homicide detective if you are a clinical psychopath? And what he said was that it allowed him to remove emotions from the investigations, because he had the opportunity to analyze the facts of a crime scene, analyze the facts of a true crime story, and not be clouded by emotions, because as someone who was psychopathic, he could assess other people who were working in similar professions, as well as perhaps just people in his daily life or people who are just trying to talk about these cases. And he saw that they were very, very emotional in certain areas where he was not. Now, he followed up with some certain points about how, even though he is a clinical psychopath, he was married, and he did enjoy spending time with his wife. And some people were calling him out instantly on that and just saying that, now, if you enjoy spending time with someone, are you truly a clinical psychopath? Or are you truly someone who does not experience human empathy? Because I remember this from the show Dexter that I was talking to you guys about on one of the recent True Crime Talk radio episodes, when he said that if I did have feelings, I would have them for my sister, even though it's an adoptive sister. And the actors that played those characters on the show actually got married in real life. But, I mean, if I did have feelings, I would have feelings for her. As soon as I heard that, being like 20 years old or something, I was thinking, that means you have feelings. Now, I think that that guy probably was capable of understanding and experiencing empathy, but he also stated, and he wanted to clarify, that he entered into relationships, even being a homicide detective, because of practicality, benefits. He thought that he would be good at it. And when someone who has psychopathic tendencies is forming a relationship with somebody, usually done, it's for, well, just that, practicality and benefits. It's not done for some type of emotional reward and connection. And some of you guys have been asking about Dr. Jordan Peterson on these True Crime Talk radio episodes. And I was watching a video that he participated in, and I'm not sure the exact channel that hosted it, because a lot of his stuff gets cut up into clips and put on different channels. But in the thumbnail, it said the Ted Bundy effect. And he was talking about serial killers. And he said, though, that the reason why he wants to talk about things like serial killers, homicide, as well as bigger things like Red China and the Soviet Union, is because it can be beneficial for us, for people like you and me, to understand what is evil, to understand what is wrong, to understand what is bad, and then do the exact opposite. Now, those are his words. That's his terminology. And because I watched that one video, I've been recommended to watch a bazillion other videos from Jordan Peterson on the concept of good and evil. But for me, somebody who's just following true crime cases and talking to you guys about True Crime Talk Radio, I sort of understand it in a different way when I just began to think destructive behavior. Like, we understand what is destructive and what is harmful to humanity. And just again, doing that though, go the exact opposite. Because a lot of people have been critical of me for talking about true crime cases for years. Even before I was doing Black Box Online Radio, they would say, no, 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 that's glorifying the criminal. And I really did not believe that. And I think Peterson encapsulated it much better than I ever could, just by that simple thing. Understanding what's destructive and doing the exact opposite, avoiding it, recognizing that it has no place in our discussions. And Charlie says she's been on a Peterson kick lately. And Peter said something I wanted to share in the chat, but I completely forgot. All right, Charlie, if you remember that, you can put that in the chat, and I will try to respond to that. Now, there is something else, though, that's been going around a lot. And on the most recent Zodiac Monday episode, I was talking to you guys about the J-Foy videos on TikTok and the Zodiac Killer. And this is something that most of you are probably familiar with. Most of you are probably aware of J-Foy's videos where he is accusing his grandfather, Richard Hoffman, of being the Zodiac Killer. And every day on, like, Monday through Friday anyway, I release shorts that come out on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. And today I was just uploading the Black Box Online Radio short. And because I've watched J-Foy's videos in the past, I was recommended one. And, like, that's what was playing on TikTok. I don't understand how it works. I really don't watch TikTok videos, only this stuff from J-Foy about the Zodiac Killer. And he was having somewhat of an emotional breakdown because he was saying that he thought that he had made an enormous discovery in this new TikTok video. He thought that he had made some enormous type of understanding about the Zodiac Killer. But in reality, he dealt with a lot of backlash from people in his personal life, as well as from people online. And he just began to think he didn't quite understand it. And he's almost on the verge of tears and so on. And I'm not faulting him for that. I'm not faulting him for that because it seems like he made some videos. He didn't know that they were going to go viral, and he's just dealing with a lot of criticism the way that anybody would, or anybody in this particular context, because people are going to be analyzing the information in a different way. And one of the people to do this was Ken Maines, who did a direct response to the J-Foy videos on his channel Unsolved No More. Ken Maines was one of the investigators on the show The Hunt for the Zodiac Killer. He also has a book out called Unsolved No More. And he's released some new book called Echoes of Evil, I think is the name, but he has lots of publications out there. They're available on his website as well as on Amazon.com. And Charlie says that guy was wild. Do you mean J-Foy or somebody else, Charlie? Okay, though. So Ken Maines made this video, and he said, there are some reasons why he doesn't like particular trends, like what's going on with J-Foy talking about his grandfather, Richard Hoffman, being the Zodiac Killer. But the first thing that I wanted to share with you guys is something that I actually think is very good from Ken Maines, and this is why I like him. Because he said that the reason why he explores true crime cases is because, number one, the victims. Number two, the victims' families. And number three, the ripple effects. And I was like, ripple effects. I know exactly what he was talking about. I knew exactly where he was going, but I wanted to hear it anyway. Saying the ripple effects, meaning that watching how people in the general public respond to these types of cases, respond to these stories, respond to everything that has been shared, and how certain people begin to believe it. Because what he said is, this guy, J-Foy, is releasing these videos on TikTok talking about his grandfather, Richard Hoffman, being the Zodiac Killer. And he provided 5 reasons why, perhaps, the RH that's written on the desktop home at Riverside, California, RH, Richard Hoffman, possibly knowing Darlene Ferrin, possibly having a Nebraska connection the way that Sherry Jo Bates had a Nebraska connection, simple things like that. And countless people on the internet have accepted that, okay, well, Richard Hoffman was most likely the Zodiac Killer. They just simply accepted this particular narrative. And they just sort of think that J-Foy is on the right track. And Ken Maines openly called that out and just said, that's not how you solve a cold case. That is not how you are able to even understand a true crime case. Now, I'm going to be clear about some things. Ken Maines is the real deal. He is a former detective and investigator, and I am not. He has a master's in forensic criminology, and I do not. But in terms of just looking at how people act online, or just looking at how people respond to stories that they hear. I think that there's some things that go a little bit overboard, because what Ken Maines is going to follow up with is saying that, hey, when it comes to real evidence, you need things like DNA, fingerprints, palm prints, all of those things. Well, yes, yes, of course. It would be so much more beneficial to try and solve a true crime case with fingerprints, DNA, and palm prints. But guess what? Not everybody has access to things like that. Not everybody has access to these types of forensic materials at their disposal. And I mean, like, what is Jay Foy going to do? Is he just going to go to Walmart and get some type of do-it-yourself DNA kit and then just, send his results to the FBI? Is he just going to get like some fingerprint things from Toys R Us or whatever, and like the ink things that they used to have, and just do his own fingerprint analysis and compare that to Richard Hoffman's? I mean, really, really, the average person cannot conduct those types of forensic investigations on their own. But what we can do is look at the letters and try to analyze them, look for linguistic clues and similarities, as well as looking for possible relationships that could have happened. And that's exactly what Jay Foy did. And to the credit of Jay Foy, he was very clear that a lot of these things are not his original observations. They've been on the internet for years. He said that in the very first video. Internet sleuths have been throwing around the name Richard Hoffman as a Zodiac Killer suspect for years. You also have Robert Graceman writing in his 1986 book that Richard Hoffman was known to a Zodiac victim, Darlene Ferrin. I'm getting him ahead of myself there. And he's even insinuating that Richard Hoffman had a relationship with Darlene Ferrin. So I'm giving credit to Jay Foy for this. I would be on his side for that. Like, I mean, yes, of course, if you just had a fingerprints from somebody at every single crime scene, as well as perhaps from the murder of Sherry Jo Bates, and you could just kind of put them into your own sort of makeshift fingerprint program on your own personal computer. Yeah, if you could do that, right, but not everybody can. I mean, and people have been trying to contact the FBI for years. People even ask me, hey, Ned, can you make the call for the FBI to me? I tried calling before and they just hang up on me. Adam Ivester of the Real Zodiac Killer Reveal channel tried calling the FBI 7 times to get them to hear his Zodiac Killer evidence. They hang up on him every single time. Scott Bobbitt is here. Hey, Scott, how you doing? Fire Pixie is here. Hey. Good morning, Fire Pixie. And Tyler Scott is here saying 6 degrees of separation. I could make a video of a family member and claim that he's the Zodiac. I'd have to twist and lie, but actual facts could make a case. Lacey is here saying, good morning, Ned and everyone. And okay, Tyler, yes. That's why Ken Maines is calling out Jay Foy, saying, you might be accusing an innocent person of being the Zodiac Killer. You might be accusing somebody who had nothing to do with the murders of being the Zodiac. And I just thought it was so interesting about the timing, because I did my video on Monday being very critical of everything Jay Foy was saying. Hey, this stuff isn't really evidence. And somebody wrote to me in the comment section saying, well, hey, like, give the guy a break or something. He's just presenting his findings. Have you 100% debunked Richard Hoffman? No. And then I had such a different experience being in the audience of Ken Maines' channel as opposed to just being the host of this program. Because when I was in the audience, I was just thinking, hey, give this guy a break. Have you debunked Richard Hoffman as a suspect? When you hear the things presented in different ways. And Ken Maines wants to talk about the ripple effects that go on. He wants to talk about how people respond to these particular pieces of information, the news stories and the types of material. And he says a lot of people are stupid. A lot of people are idiots. He insults a lot of people like that. And then even goes to say that there are certain news outlets such as TMZ that pick up these stories and they air them and they run them and they get a lot of publicity. And TMZ is also a bunch of idiots. Here is something that I will disagree with. TMZ is not a stupid organization. Harvey and the gang over there at TMZ, they're not stupid. And here's the following explanation. They are all about publicity, entertainment, viewership, ratings. That's their business. And they have succeeded. They aren't about integrity. They're sort of a walking tabloid. And they've always claimed to be. Harvey Levin openly stated that he wanted to just take these covert videos of celebrities in awkward situations and just share them with the world. But the one condition was people could share their videos for free as long as they put TMZ in the corner at the bottom, sort of like a free marketing campaign that actually worked. That was smart. People at TMZ are not stupid. Now, are they always moral and ethical? No, absolutely not. They are going to do a lot of bad things, but they're not stupid. Just because somebody is doing something that is violating a certain ethical code or maybe certain moral principles does not mean they are unintelligent. So I disagree with that one completely. Cat Daddy Steve is here, says good morning. And Cat Daddy Steve, you can say hello to the fox. But as far as being a little bit more critical of J-Foy, I also have to point out that it seems like not everything he's saying is going to be the strongest. It seems like not everything he's saying is going to match up completely. And it seems like he's a little bit aware of that now based on how much criticism he has received for putting out these videos about his grandfather being the Zodiac Killer. But I do have another thing to say in his defense. Ken Maines is saying that he's not providing evidence. He's just providing reasons. Just like the 5 things in the first video about the RH, the Darlene Ferrin connection, and so on. He said that's not evidence. Those are reasons. I also disagree with this. It's evidence. It's not proof necessarily, but it's evidence, to stay true to the terms. And I think that it's not strong evidence, if that's what Ken Maines is talking about. Yes, fingerprints, DNA, and palm prints, those would be stronger pieces of evidence. But in terms of just saying that the things about Richard Hoffman spelling the word until, U-N-T-I-L-L, and the Zodiac Killer also misspelled the word until, U-N-T-I-L-L, yes, that's evidence. That's a linguistic similarity. And if someone were a forensic linguist and they made that observation, then you would be saying, oh, yes, well, that's evidence now. But just when someone amateur sleuth does it, you're saying, that's not evidence, that's a reason. I believe that's also an unfair criticism. But there's a real reason why I'm talking to you guys about this. And the reason is I actually have to give a shout out to longtime BB War follower Batman66, who recommended that I watch the Ken Maines video on Unsolved No More. Every Monday I do a segment about the Zodiac Killer called Zodiac Monday, but I thought that this could not wait. For the following reason. Ken Maines says that after working on the show The Hunt for the Zodiac Killer, he obtained the DNA of the killer of Sherry Jo Bates. And I don't believe he actually has like a sample. I believe it's like the report, the findings, and it's like the numbers on some type of page and the code and all of that. But he says he has the DNA of the murderer of Sherry Jo Bates, specifically coming from the wristband that was found near Sherry Jo Bates' body. Sherry Jo Bates was murdered on October 30th of 1966. A lot of people think that she was the first victim of the Zodiac Killer. And then there's also DNA that was found on her pants. On YouTube, this was like the most widely viewed video from The Hunt from the Zodiac Killer from the History Channel, when they just had Ken Maines and his partner Sal looking at a scientist examining Sherry Jo Bates' pants that she was wearing on the night that she was murdered, and they've obtained DNA from that. And I'm going out on a limb here. I haven't examined Ken Maines' file, but it sounds like he's saying that they match, meaning that that DNA on the watch was most likely from the killer. Okay, strangely, he didn't say anything about the DNA that was found on her hand, a hair that was found on her hand in the blood. Okay, this is important for the following reason. When Ken Maines did his video on Sherry Jo Bates for the Unsolved No More YouTube channel, he just said that was everything. This is the thing that I quote him all the time in saying, if you have some type of victims, or you have a hair that is found in the victim's blood that does not belong to the victim, and you will not get a conviction and you will not get a warrant for that person's arrest if the DNA does not match. He made that the heart and soul of everything. And then just when he did this video, most recently talking about J-Foy's videos, he was saying that the DNA that he has, the reports that he have, relate to her pants and the wristband from a Timex watch that was found near her body. But he did offer J-Foy the chance to send him some type of DNA report. Again, I don't think he actually wants some type of blood sample or something like that from J-Foy, who's a biological relative of Richard Hoffman. He would have his DNA. But he wants like some type of paper report, and he will compare and contrast them. And then looking at how maybe these two things are matching up, maybe there is going to be some type of DNA match, or maybe there won't. But the real reason that the video was recommended to me was because Ken Maines says that he was contacted by the case breakers who are pushing Gary Francis Post as a Zodiac Killer suspect. And they compared Gary Post's DNA to the DNA that's on file with the Sherry Jo Bates murderer, and they did not match. There was no conclusive match. And, that is something that I think is very big and not widely talked about. And Ken Mains openly stated that the case breakers asked him not to go public with the findings. And this is something that I thought was really weird in his presentation when he was saying that, number one, he doesn't do what people tell him to do. He doesn't care. He's not going to hide the truth because somebody asked him to do that. But then they asked him to hide the truth, and he's like, yeah, whatever. I don't really care too much. Well, that's doing what other people tell you. I guess he tried to do some type of save there. But in addition to Gary Francis Post, the suspect of the case breakers, Ken Mains is also saying that somebody sent him a report on Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, who is also a Zodiac Killer suspect. And Kaczynski's DNA was ran against the murderer of Sherry Jo Bates' DNA, and that also did not match. So in terms of just breaking news, I think that these are very big findings. I think that these are it's material that we should be talking about a lot more. That's why I couldn't wait until Zodiac Monday to run it by you guys. But we have a couple things here in the chat that I would like to respond to. We have Chad K, who says, finding a Gilbert and Sullivan reference made by a so-called suspect would be more convincing than anything Jay Foy mentioned. Well, there were a lot of problems with Jay Foy's observations, because he's going back to the Robert Graysmith narrative on how there's this guy who's stalking Darlene Ferret. That's not from Graysmith. That's from the reports, right? That person, I believe, was George Waters, someone who was bothering her at the restaurant. But Graysmith tried to say that it's some guy named Lee. And then Richard Hoffman's middle name was Lee, Richard Lee Hoffman. However, if Darlene Ferrin knew him as Lee and referred to him as Lee, this contradicts something that's in Jay Foy's story, because he said on July 4th of 1969, when Darlene Ferrin was murdered, she was having a conversation with Mike Mageau, and she probably said the name Richard. That the car pulls up behind them at Blue Rock Springs Park, and Mike Mageau's like, who's that? What's going on? And Darlene Ferrin says, that's Richard. And this is something that I don't think lines up. If she knew him as Lee by his middle name and called him Lee, all of a sudden she's going to call him Richard by his first name. People don't normally do that. If you know somebody as Lee, you're probably going to call them Lee. Ben Ortega says, oh no, the case breakers. All right, so about the case breakers, Ken Mains also asked a particular challenge question to, us, the people in the audience. Why is it that we don't hear more from the case breakers? They created an enormous media firestorm with their Zodiac Killer suspect, Gary Francis Post, which is even bigger than what Jay Foy has done with his Zodiac suspect, Richard Hoffman. And the reasons why I say that the case breakers had a bigger firestorm was because they got mainstream media news outlets to look at their story. Of course, TMZ was very influential in sharing the Casebreaker story. That's why Ken Mains brought them up. But Fox News ran it. And then once you had those two news outlets sharing the story, it spread like wildfire. But the reason why Ken Mains chose to compare Jay Foy to the Casebreakers is twofold. The Casebreakers also put out their press release when they just had some very silly pieces of evidence. And yes, I'll give him that. Evidence, not reasons. The stuff about Gary Post's shirt and the lines on the forehead, and of course the shadow on the piece of wood. And he's just like, his stuff is not convincing at all. And they actually contacted Ken Mains and asked if he would attend a press conference and, say something about their suspect, endorse their suspect, or go along with this. And he just said, no, I'm not doing that. And, that's an admirable thing to do, because obviously, those aren't strong pieces of evidence. You could call it evidence. You don't have to call it reasons. But what I think is more valuable is that Ken Mains shared this, right? And he is just pointing out that they don't seem to have a lot of media discussions now. And why is that? Why aren't people talking about Gary Francis Post as much as they used to? If they think that he's a strong Zodiac Killer suspect, shouldn't they be following the lead? All right, here's my response. And I don't think this is what Ken Mains wants to hear, but I only think that the general public will look at Zodiac suspects if the mainstream media just really hampers down on them and just really zones in on them and puts out more and more content about that, more and more mainstream news coverage. A suspect has to be regularly talked about who's outside of the major suspects that are available on websites like ZodiacKiller.com or even ZodiacKillerFacts.com. When a new book comes out, people will talk about a Zodiac suspect a lot, like, say, Earl Van Best, 5, 6 years ago, whenever that was. Oh, goodness, how many was that 7 years ago? So, um, now we have some things in the chat here. Christopher Valdez says the Foy's family need to slap him. Well, I don't know exactly what happened, Christopher, but Jay Foy released a new video when he was just visibly upset, talking about how he was just really bothered by the way that certain people who were close to him responded to breaking this story about his grandfather being the Zodiac killer. Or I should be clearer and just share some additional info that certain people responded to him in a negative way about this story. And it's like, I think that maybe they did something to that effect. I have not really seen anything online about what the family would have said about this particular story, but that's what I think happened, that they got mad about him accusing a family member of being the Zodiac. And we have Michael here who says, is that guy fried? Oh, this is from Tyler saying, Michael, is that guy fried? Oh, do you mean Mike Mageau? Michael Mageau, is that guy fried? Do you sort of mean that, like, Mike Mageau isn't completely on the same page with reality as other people? Well, we were talking about that on the panel discussion show that came out 2 weeks ago on the French Wrecking Crew. And yeah, it does seem like Mike Mageau is a little bit out of touch, because this stuff about saying the name Richard before he was shot by the Zodiac killer, that Darlene Ferrin said that that's Richard, and that there's another story that the Zodiac even walked to the window and said one word, and that was the name D, calling Darlene Ferrin by her nickname, and then just starts shooting into the car. Where's that stuff in the police reports? Where was that stuff 50 years ago? My honest take on the subject is I don't believe those things happened. But in terms of just looking at how people analyze cases, somebody like Ken Maines, who again is the real deal, he had the TV show where he could investigate this stuff. Someone like him was also very dismissive of the theory that a suspect like Ross Sullivan couldn't have murdered Sherry Jo Bates, and a suspect like Lawrence Kane couldn't have been the Zodiac killer. He's like, yeah, when we were working on the History Channel show, they asked us to look at Ross Sullivan and look at Lawrence Kane for being the Zodiac killer. But I was like, well, now slow down, wait a second. And already he jumps to the next sentence by saying, some people out there think that these two guys could have been the killers together and they would have done it in tandem. And that's stupid. That's what he's saying. I'm like, now, wait a second. Why on earth would you be so dismissive? Because all of the strong points about Ross Sullivan and his connections to the Zodiac Killer mystery are relevant to Riverside, where Sherry Jo Bates was murdered in 1966. Then you have the Zodiac murders in Northern California, not Riverside in Southern California, but Northern California. And the majority of the strong connections to Lawrence Kane are in Northern California and Nevada as well. With the disappearance of Donna Last, Lawrence Kane lived in Nevada. So I'm just thinking that why would you completely dismiss something like that when it's completely feasible at face value? You might think it's a little bit unlikely. Maybe he knows something that I don't, because he worked on the show investigating these suspects and he is a real detective. But I just think that it's almost as if he's going to be a little bit closed-minded to certain aspects of these types of investigations. Wade Richards is here and says, sounds like anyone close to the Zodiac case becomes a suspect nowadays. Well, yes, Richard Hoffman does. And, he was the first officer on site at Blue Rock Springs. And then he finds Darlene Ferrin and Mike Mageau. He goes to the hospital in the ambulance with Darlene Ferrin, and apparently he's witnessing everything that's happening to her, watching the ambulance attendant breathe into her. And some people were saying that this should be immediately debunked, because if he took the ambulance to the hospital, he's in the ambulance at the hospital, the Zodiac is going to make a phone call at 12:40 a.m. from a place 2.2 miles away, and Darlene Ferrin's pronounced dead at 12:38 a.m. If he was at the hospital, doesn't he have an alibi for the phone call? Number one, there could have been some other active participant. Number two, he could have lied about some type of timeline issue. He could have snuck out and gone and made the call. All right, I get that. But they're saying, how could he have gone to the payphone if he took the ambulance to the hospital? borrowed somebody's car keys. I don't know. Stolen somebody's car keys. I don't know. I'm not saying that happened. I'm just pointing out that those are the first things that come to mind when somebody tells you that something is impossible. Do you ever have those moments where you're like, maybe that's not necessarily impossible? Because you guys know on Black Box Online Radio, I love challenge questions. And Cat Daddy Steve says, look, Ross could have killed Sherry Joe Bates and Lawrence could have been the Berryessa killer, but neither of them were the full-on Zodiac. I don't think there's any evidence that it would really connect Lawrence Kane to stuff. I just wanted to point out that the majority of theorizing and hypothesizing, and people like Harvey Hines are going to point out, is that Kane is connected to Northern California and Nevada. Ross's biggest connections are to Southern California and Riverside. Why dismiss everything? Yala Yolo is here. And hello, Yala. Welcome to True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. And the Fox would like to say hello. And yes, True Crime Talk Radio in the morning is coming to you every Tuesday and Thursday for the summer at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And on Mondays, I do a segment about the Zodiac Killer. On Wednesdays, I talk to you guys about Jack the Ripper. And on Fridays, we talk about D.B. Cooper. And if you want to follow along with all of these true crime discussions, you can hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. You can also contribute via the super thanks on YouTube super chats, as well as visiting buymeacoffee.com. buymeacoffee.com/blackboxnid88. That allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And I also release short content on YouTube, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram under the names Black Box Online Radio and Black Box Ned. All right, so we have something from Home Run 916 who says, Foxy Ned. That's right, that's right. The Fox appreciates you, Home Run. And we have Chad K with a comment saying, do we even know if Hoffman, Ross, or Kane had an interest in cryptology? Their colleagues and her family would have probably known. Oh, yes, Lawrence Kane absolutely had an interest in cryptology. I mean, not an interest. He allegedly learned about it in the Navy. And, well, this is the stuff that Ken Maines was trying to share with people. And we have Ross Sullivan. I've heard things about him having an interest in codes. I haven't really seen anything super substantial. Richard Hoffman, I don't know, but, he had a military background as well. It's possible. And Jeff Jones says, hi, Ned. Hello to you, Jeff Jones. And I would like to switch gears a little bit, and I would like to talk to you guys about a different story, one that I just happened to catch on Black Box, on someone else's YouTube channel that was definitely not Black Box Online Radio. And it's the story of Peter Lundin, who was a Danish serial killer. And he was featured in the thumbnail of a video. He had painted half of his face black, and he was just talking all about poetry and so on while he was painting his face for a prison interview. And he was a serial killer that was born in Denmark and then moved to the United States of America at an early age. And they were introducing him as a Danish serial killer, but he very clearly had a pronounced Southern accent, like from the Carolinas. And he's just sort of like, yo, whatever has an up has a down. Whatever's a line goes around. Sort of talking like that. I mean, definitely more Southern than I am, even though I'm from West Virginia. And yes, Peter Lundin, he was a serial killer who murdered his mother, actually, and his father covered up the crime. And then he was incarcerated for it, convicted of manslaughter. Then he was sent back to Denmark, deported. He was escorted by 4 officers back to Denmark, where he just lived and got into a lot of trouble with the law. But he ultimately ended up murdering 3 people in a triple homicide and then was sent to Danish prison. And it's a bizarre story because you have 4 victims, and it does meet the definition of being a serial killer. However, this particular individual is somebody who committed his crimes only on 2 separate events. One of the victims was his mother, and then the other 3 people were a family that he was actually living with. A very, very different type of serial killer. But the thing that stood out to me was, and perhaps the reason why the video was recommended to me a la the YouTube algorithm, was because I've been watching a lot of things about criminal psychology. And Peter Lundin was somebody who had a 39 out of 40 on the Hare checklist. The Hare checklist is a 40-point system that is used to determine if somebody is a psychopath or not. And if you score 30 out of 40 or higher, you're deemed to be a psychopath. And he scored a 39. And it's almost as if, this is like the born to kill hypothesis. And that was what was discussed in one of the videos that I was watching about him, when they were saying that this is the case of somebody who might have genuinely been born to kill. And then he goes to prison in America for murdering his mother. And then he gets this opportunity to be interviewed by a Danish TV documentary. And they're saying that they want to explore the lives of Danes who are living in places abroad like America. And he just gives this dramatic prison interview that's done almost in this type of, optimistic way on his part. As I said, he's speaking in poetry and painting his face and playing the guitar and lifting weights. And that actually got women from Denmark to fall in love with him. And they had started sending him prison letters and so on. And it was absolutely catastrophic. But it's all about the psychopathic tendency of glib and superficial charm. So, he went back to Denmark, and he was escorted by 4 police officers during the trip. But then the Danish authorities got into a lot of trouble for not putting him under surveillance, or a lot of controversy rather than trouble. And they're like, this guy was not monitored or supervised at all in Denmark, and then he went on to kill again. Could this not have been avoided? And this is something that I think could potentially be somewhere between a rock and a hard place, because the reason why they didn't is he committed a crime in America, he served his time in America, and then he was deported. And they're like, well, he didn't commit any crimes on Danish soil. He didn't actually commit any crimes in Denmark. He was already let out of prison, so he wasn't actually a criminal at the time. But it's just this whole thing about, are certain people demonstrate tendencies that are homicidal enough that they should be placed under surveillance. Now, as far as the born to kill hypothesis goes, I think that he's a very bizarre example of this because, as I said, he murdered his mother, but his father helped him cover it up. His father even helped him bury the body. And his father also assisted him with the crime in Denmark. So, do you guys remember from the True Crime Talk Radio episode that we did discussing the different types of the dark triad traits? Some people facilitate the dark triad traits in other people. Some people are co-conspirators in others' dark triad traits. Like they enable and reinforce, encourage, all of that. And I might be going out on a limb here, but I think that if this guy had his father helping him bury the body of his mother, that's facilitation, or that is facilitating or being a co-conspirator. But that's just me. And these types of stories are very bizarre because we want to understand more about humanity, but the very simple aspect of it is so much attention gets paid to people who make a lot of noise. How about Ted Bundy, for example? Because the first video that I was watching on Peter Lundin was all about Ted Bundy, Peter Lundin, and this one other criminal from, the Netherlands, I believe. And he wasn't very memorable. Oh, and Jeff Jones jumps in to say some things about Ken Maines. He does nothing but complain anymore. Well, I think I called him out on some things here that he was complaining a little bit too much, even though it's his YouTube channel. He has every right to. He's perhaps showing emotion in some good ways. It's perhaps good that he's curious about how the ripple effects affect society. Perhaps it's good that he's curious about how members of the general public just look at 5 reasons or pieces of evidence why someone could be the Zodiac Killer, and he takes those 5 reasons and they take those 5 reasons, and then they just think that this person's the Zodiac. Insufficient evidence all around. I will agree with him to that. I can drink to that with the Fox. But I don't think that he is completely open to all of the suggestions, or perhaps he is prematurely dismissive to certain things that have been shared. There was a different true crime video that I was watching just recently. It was something that just popped up from some generic channel that was called something like True Crime, and it was talking about the murder of a woman named Caroline Crouch, who was murdered in Greece. And the culprit turned out to be her husband, a man named Babis. And it's very similar to some of the things that I've been discussing on True Crime Talk Radio. For example, the Chris Watts case. For example, the Jeffrey McDonald case, where a man murders his family and then tries to stage the scene and make it look like somebody else did it. And with Chris Watts is a little bit different because Chris Watts didn't personally attack himself. He just kind of like walked away like, what? I don't know. And Chris Watts is a very calculating individual because he even put on a drastic performance a dramatic performance in the courtroom one time when he was advised by attorneys to be more emotional. And more you learn about that guy, the sicker you get. And with Jeffrey McDonald, he is somebody who said that at least 4 people entered his home one night singing a song like "Acid is Groovy, Kill the Pigs," and they murdered his family, but he was able to survive. And ultimately, he was convicted of that. And with this guy Babis from Greece and the murder of Caroline Crouch, only the woman was murdered. There was an 11-month-old baby in the house who was not harmed. And he just said that there were 4 attackers. They were wearing black hoods, but one of them removed the hood and left it behind, and the hood was found. And he said that it was a tall, large man with a dark complexion, so on. And there was money that was hidden in a particular box. Actually, it was a box for a Monopoly game. That's what he and his wife used to hide their money in. And the money was stolen, as well as 20,000 euros worth of jewelry. And then it was just really turning into something that seemed a little bit too convenient, a little bit too obvious, because there certainly wasn't enough evidence of a break-in. There was a broken window in the basement, but if he said that this very large, tall man broke into the house and the window was absolutely tiny. Plus, it's the same story with Jeffrey McDonald. And that's why I wanted to talk to you guys about this on True Crime Talk Radio, because Jeffrey McDonald is saying that 4 people broke into his house, right? And he was attacked, but he had only minimal injuries compared to his family members who were murdered. This whole thing about, well, the man isn't really a threat, so we're going to murder the woman and the children. They're the bigger threats. We're just going to go easy on the guy. And with the story of Babis and the murder of Caroline Crouch, he tried to play a similar defense, just saying that, oh, well, he was seeping in and out of consciousness, therefore they probably just thought that he was dead. And his wife was a kickboxer. She had a black belt. She probably put up a very large fight. And what actually convicted this Babis guy was that he said that the murder occurred at a certain time, like 4 a.m. I'm just using an example, but there was a security camera in his house, and the security camera even had this electronic record that demonstrated that it had been broken and disabled at 1:20 a.m., hours before the murder took place. And his wife had been wearing a smartwatch that showed her heart activity and when she was sleeping. You know, like those smartwatches can record when you're asleep and when you're awake and when you're stressed and all of that. And all of that stuff happened at 3:50 to 4 a.m. They knew he was lying, and he was caught and busted. And just, it's another example that's just reminded me so much of the Jeffrey McDonald case. 4 intruders. I don't know why they're going with that. 4 intruders. Stage as some type of bizarre crime where the man is barely hurt, and then he gets caught easily. But I'd like to get to some things in the chat. And Until Tomorrow says, I can't tolerate Ken Maines' ego. Ken Maines is stubborn. Fire Pixie says, and so angry. Ken can be unpleasant, but he's seen some shit. I get the callousness. Well, Tyler's the one who said that last one. I get the callousness. I think with him, though, he says very clearly that he deals with a lot of generational issues. And the people that are older than him, that are older detectives, they don't necessarily like everything about him the way that he doesn't like some of these true crime programs out there. And I might be a little bit partial to this, but Ken Maines was saying, when they make true crime documentaries now, they don't always get detectives from the cases. Sometimes they just get podcasters and people from YouTube, and then they're just, maybe telling the story, but they aren't familiar with how investigations are conducted. And I agree and disagree with that statement so closely. Now, somebody like me, even though I try to watch as much Forensic Files as I can and similar shows, I have not done this stuff firsthand the way that he has. But in terms of telling the story, yes, you can turn to people like YouTubers and podcasters, because there are different aspects to analyzing the true crime world. And sometimes I might not be able to tell you how to do DNA analysis, but I can read a book, and I can read a second book, and I'd be like, wait a second, these two things don't match up. I was just talking about Babis and the murder of Caroline Crouch and the similarities to Jeffrey McDonald. I can look at these two ideas and look at how they are similar, and look at the patterns in human behavior, and look at this giant collective of ideas. And, I mean, I've been watching true crime stuff for 30 years. I don't get an award for that, though. But, in terms of just talking about things on film, I'm not going to stop running my mouth on the internet, and neither should you guys in the chat. Yes, put anything you want in the chat and share anything you want. People have a right to their opinions and a right to express ideas. And moreover, just because somebody is a member of law enforcement or a detective does not mean that they are going to be holier than thou or high and mighty. Should we just endorse everything that Steve Hodel says about the Zodiac Killer? Should we just endorse everything that John Cameron says about Edward Wayne Edwards, not only being the Zodiac, but also murdering JonBenet Ramsey, about just committing 660 murders? These guys are former detectives and members of law enforcement, and they say some really far-out stuff. Steve Odell talking about the first Zodiac murder taking place in 1921, the murder of Father Patrick Henslin. Just because somebody has that on their resume, that is not necessarily something that we should admire. Well, I take back, not the word admire. It's not just the be-all, end-all. And it doesn't mean they deserve a place in the world of media and other people do not. Danny Novak has a question for us in the chat saying, are you guys doing a French Wrecking Crew video this week? Well, the next one will actually be coming out on Monday. We were planning on doing a panel discussion show about the Zodiac Killer on the French Wrecking Crew, which is run by Jerome. But some people, including me, were not able to participate on the most recent one, which would have, I guess, been Monday afternoon, Eastern Standard Time. So we will be moving that to next week, and we should have a bigger lineup than before. Oh, Jeff Jones says Helena Stokely. Now, Helena Stokely, Jeff Jones, she is the witness from the Jeffrey McDonald case that might actually be someone who is not telling the truth. I mean, she would be the person that allegedly entered Jeffrey McDonald's house on the night that his family was murdered and was holding a candle saying, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs," and is just chanting that over and over again. And what was that name of that documentary? False Witness, right, about the Jeffrey McDonald case, because ultimately she goes on to admit that she was there and that she did it, even though the forensic evidence is almost completely contrary to that story, and there's certainly not a lot of evidence that she was in the house. I mean, if they have every single fiber that Jeffrey McDonald left behind in all these odd places, they don't have a single fiber coming from Helena Stokely. Maybe she just got confused, like what people were saying about Mike Mageau having PTSD. Chilling with the fox for a second. And 42 Lehman says, Hodel is terrible. Somebody wrote into the channel recently, and they responded to my debunking episode on Steve Hodel's Zodiac Killer suspect, George Hill Hodel, his father, whom he accuses of committing dozens of murders. And Steve Hodel and I have had some interactions. He's always been polite with me, always been fair with me, and I do appreciate that. But someone just said, thank you for making this video and calling him out about how everything he says about the Zodiac Killer is wrong. Until Tomorrow says, never endorse anything, remain objective until you discover irrefutable proof. Oh yes, but sometimes I do make determinations prematurely. Until Tomorrow, there are some true crime cases where, I have very strong stances. I told you guys in the JonBenet Ramsey case, I think it was an intruder. I don't think it was the Ramsey family. The Jeffrey McDonald case, I think he did it. I don't think it was a group of intruders. And, it's going to go on and on. For a while, I thought very highly of George Hodel as a Black Dahlia Avenger suspect. And he might even still be my top suspect, although people on the internet, as well as in the world of publishing, have encouraged me to look more at Leslie Dillon for being the Black Dahlia Avenger, but never endorse anything. Sometimes I go a little bit down those pathways. Jeff Main says, Ken Mains is okay, but he complains about the same shit every time. Why? Oh, these are two questions, actually. Complaining about the same shit every time. I complain about a lot of the same shit, as they say. Same shit, different day. Jeff Jones says, why does Helena Stokely lie? What does she have to gain? The way that I understood the documentary False Witness is that Helena Stokely is the witness in the Jeffrey McDonald case who admits that she was there, even though maybe she wasn't. It's that someone shared this story that a woman matching her description was in the house, and she was doing a lot of drugs at the time, and she maybe have convinced herself that she actually did it. And what some people think is that Jeffrey McDonald knew Helena Stokely. He saw her around town. That's why he gave this almost picture perfect definition of her. She was wearing a fluffy, wide brimmed hat and had like long blonde hair, which would have been a long blonde wig that she was wearing. And, he just used that as the description. And then he's just saying, that, oh, yeah, I saw these 4 people on the street corner. That's in his mind. But what he says is, yeah, this woman with a fluffy hat and long blonde hair was in my house, chanting acid is groovy, kill the pigs. Well, she may have actually thought that she did it because she was high on drugs during the night of. She got confused. She began to doubt herself, and it could have been invented false memories. You going to confess to not being at a murder scene when you're not? Well, it's like people do things like that. People confess to murders that they didn't commit. People confess to crimes that they didn't commit. More than 100 people have confessed to being D.B. Cooper. Louis Myers confessed to being the Zodiac Killer on his deathbed to Randy Kenny. And Tom Voigt of ZodiacKiller.com was actually the one to tell me that story is true, because Randy Kenny contacted him before Louis Myers had passed away. People confess to things all the time. Christopher Valdez says, Hodel claims his dad is responsible for every major unsolved crime of the 20th century. Well, Christopher, even solved crimes. As far as I understand, the murder of Father Patrick Heslin that I was talking to you about was solved. They found the perpetrator, and I don't recall his exact name. I've discussed it once on Black Box Online Radio, but they found the guy because he buried this priest, Father Patrick Heslin, in a patch of sand, and the sand particles matched up to some things that were on this guy's clothes, and they had forensic evidence. But then Hodel's like, wait a second. Maybe it wasn't him. Maybe it was the Zodiac Killer. So even solved crimes get attributed to this person. John Cameron does the same thing. Like when he said that Edward Wayne Edwards murdered Darlie Roudier's kids, and Darlie Roudier's been convicted for that crime. He's like, nope, wasn't her. It was Edward Wayne Edwards. Because what John Cameron does is he just says that Edward Wayne Edwards would murder people and frame somebody else. So no matter which crime occurs, he can always take it back and blame it on Edward Wayne Edwards. I just have no justification for that. Until Tomorrow says, later a synthetic hair was supposedly found in the house and it's been attributed to a wig Helena Stokely was wearing. Then later it was attributed to a doll. Yeah, see, that's it though, Until Tomorrow. I'm like, Helena Stokely can say some things about the Jeffrey McDonald case about how she was in the house, but I'm like, if they have all of these fibers from other people, there's not a single scuff mark from her boots, and it should have been really wet that night from rain. There's not a single fiber from this wig. Like, if you were just to tell me that they found a synthetic hair from that blonde wig, I'd be like, yeah, that's the evidence that Ken Maines is talking about. But once they said that synthetic fiber came from a doll that was owned by one of the McDonald girls, doesn't convince me. And Austin Martin says, hopefully they can catch the Ripper before too much time has passed. Wouldn't that be something, Austin, if some way, somehow they could identify Jack the Ripper? There's less and less evidence every day. And somebody was talking about the diary of Jack the Ripper on Whipper Wednesday, about how somebody found this diary from a suspect named James Maybrick, and saying that, he confessed to being Jack the Ripper. I wish something like that were authentic with certainty, and that it provided a bunch of details about the crimes, and then you could just be like, most likely that was the Ripper. But as Richard Jones of Jack the Ripper Tour said, we're never going to know the truth. Chad K says, has James Fitzgerald, the forensic linguist who solved the Unabomber, supported any investigations into any Zodiac suspects? Oh, I don't know, actually, Chad. I'm not familiar with James Fitzgerald. I'm going to have to look into him. But all right, everybody, this episode of True Crime Talk Radio in the Morning is winding down. You can put anything you want in the chat, and I'll try my best to respond to that. But you guys know where to find the stuff. blackboxonlineradio@aol.com is how you get in touch with the show. And, I'm on social media. My name is Ned DeHaan on Facebook, Black Box Online Radio on Facebook, BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram and TikTok. 42 Lehman says, I've had interactions with both Larry Harnish and Hodel. Hodel couldn't answer simple questions about 1940s, but Larry Harnish could. Well, I'm not necessarily surprised too much. He seems mostly locked into his theory, but no matter what people say about Steve Hodel, I think he's a genuine believer in the Black Dahlia Avenger theory, that his father was the Black Dahlia Avenger. I think he believes that wholeheartedly. But all right, thank you guys so much for listening to True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. And as I said, you guys know how to keep in touch. And I will be with you tomorrow for Cooper Friday, talking all about DB Cooper. That'll be all for me now. Until next time.